Everybody, this is my week 2 presentation for the Denmark trip, and today I'll be talking about the dark history between Greenland and Denmark. So, just a few things we're going to cover today. First is going to be the history between the I guess the country and its territory, in terms of its relations, dating back to just after the end of World War II all the way up to the current events of 2025. And next, we're going to cover kind of the injustices and grievances that were behind the scenes of the decolonization of Greenland and how those circumstances kind of relate to a Western Hemisphere situation, specifically in the United States. And finally, we'll be talking about how the current political events surrounding the potential, buying of Greenland by the U.S. government kind of impacts the future of Greenland and Denmark's relations. So, again, just a brief history of the relationship. In 1945, just after World War II, the UN passed a charter essentially stating that all countries within the UN that have territories need to actively work towards providing, better standards of living and quality of life in those countries. Now, Greenland being a territory or a colony of Denmark at the time, that fell under that charter and ultimately gave way to potential decolonization talks, and eventually in between 1953 and 1954, Greenland was decolonized and made a county or territory of Denmark. And as we will see in the next slide, there was a lot of the dark behind the scenes injustices and situations that went along with that. In 1979, Greenland gained a little bit more political autonomy through the Act on Greenland self-governance. Through this act, a Greenlandic parliament was established. And finally, in 2009, a more revised version of the 1979 Act on Greenland Self-Governance, Greenland was able to establish its very own departments. So, just kind of, again, although Greenland was decolonized, there was a lot of kind of injustices that went along behind the scenes of that decolonization. One, the all of the Inuit children who proved to be kind of bright and had a really promising future were uprooted from their homes in Greenland and were forced to live in Denmark for about 2 years to learn the culture, learn the language, and kind of learn everything there is to know about Denmark, and ultimately in an attempt to kind of wash away their Inuit heritage and Greenlandic heritage, and those two are often interchangeable because there's a very high Inuit population in Greenland. And oftentimes, when these kids were returned from their homes, because they were so washed by this Denmark culture that they oftentimes couldn't, relate or even speak to their friends or their peers because they simply didn't know the language anymore. And oftentimes, this led to, they couldn't find a job and they oftentimes lived on the street, which ultimately increased poverty and unemployment. And this is kind of really gets dark. Basically, the Danish government was trying to control the finances and the spending through acquiring their new territory in Greenland by forcing women um, ages as young as 12 to get IUDs. And I won't go into the details of an IUD because it's very graphic, but essentially what it does, it prevents a woman's ability to get pregnant. And essentially what their goal was to control birth rates through these unwanted IUDs. And through controlling birth rates, they were able to control kind of the finances and the spending that came with just raising children in general, which ultimately would lead to a more friendly budget in the eyes of the Danish government. And finally, the fishing industry is the number one leading industry in Greenlandic GDP and economic output. And oftentimes, during the mid 1950s, fishermen were forced to relocate and move fishing regions. Oftentimes, they just were left with nowhere to go and they were out of a job. So that was a major economic downturn in Greenland. And essentially, just the main goal of all of these is to kind of wash the Inuit and Greenlandic heritage and pride to ultimately be replaced by a sense of Danish nationalism. And in terms of the Western Hemisphere comparison I mentioned earlier, I believe this is similar to the Native American assimilation into American culture through similar methods. Like the Native children were taken from their homes and put in place in these boarding schools where they would cut off their hair and wash them of their native traditions and native rituals, and in order to just teach them and raise them in an American society, or what they believe to be a true American society. So I believe this is really just the most comparable circumstance in terms of things that go on here in the United States. And finally, how like I said in the beginning slides, how the current political events are kind of shaping the um, future relations between Denmark and Greenland. Primarily, if the U.S. was to buy Greenland, it would free Greenland of Danish control, which obviously through this dark history, as we mentioned previously, that would be a win for Greenland. That would be a positive, for sure. But on the other hand, much like the United States government with the Native Americans, Greenland is attempting to establish or Denmark is attempting to establish reparations with Greenland by granting them a large amounts of subsidies. For example, they've given Greenland over $600 million to put into their healthcare system, so that obviously is beneficial to Greenland. So if the U.S. was to buy the territory, that would be they would lose the opportunity to keep that flow of subsidies coming in. But however, and this is kind of point number three is kind of speaking more to a Greenlandic independence point. If Greenland was to be free of Danish control, they have major economic opportunity in the energy space, specifically in the renewable energy space. Much like their Greenland renewable geography is much comparable to Denmark in as a sense that they have lots of space for onshore and offshore wind farms and solar farms. But what sets them apart from Denmark is they have a high concentration of critical minerals, and critical minerals are such an essential and hot topic right now, mainly due to the current rise in the renewable energy transition. And these minerals are, for example, lithium is necessary in constructing lithium-ion batteries, which are applicable in electric vehicles and lots of other renewable infrastructure. So if these talks were to go on and Greenland was, whether they be bought by the U.S. or in a place to gain independence, there would be major economic opportunity in the energy space, and that is coming in at the perfect time, considering the kind of the trajectory of the energy stance from a global perspective. And these are my sources. I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for listening.